The first crack appeared in the deep end sometime during the winter. By spring, Thomas Mackenzie could slide his entire hand into the fissure, feeling the cold earth beneath the deteriorating concrete. The 30-year-old in-ground pool had finally surrendered to time, frost heaves, and neglect, much like his marriage. $7,000 to repair, the contractor had said, whistling low as he tapped his clipboard. And honestly, Mr. Mackenzie, that's just to make it safe. The filtration system, the liner. We're looking at another 5 easy. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, staring at the rectangular eyesore that dominated his backyard. The murky water reflected the gray April sky, filled with last autumn's leaves and what appeared to be a waterlogged tennis ball. 3 years since Diane had left, taking the kids every other weekend in all swim season, and Thomas couldn't remember the last time anyone had actually enjoyed the pool. It had become nothing but a money pit, a mosquito breeding ground, and a constant reminder of happier times he couldn't get back. 12 grand to fix something nobody uses, he muttered to himself, or 5 grand to fill it in. The decision wasn't difficult after that. Thomas hadn't given much thought to notifying the neighbors. The property was fenced on both sides, and he'd lived in the suburban cul-de-sac long enough to establish the kind of neighborly relationship where everyone waved politely or rarely spoke. His direct neighbors to the north, the Millers, were a middle-aged couple who traveled frequently. To the south lived Eleanor Pembroke, a widow in her 70s who had moved in 2 years ago and immediately installed a security camera system that would make the Pentagon jealous. On Monday morning, the demolition crew arrived promptly at 7. 2 burly men in work boots and a young woman operating a small excavator made quick work of breaking up the concrete deck. By noon, they had drained the remaining water and begun dismantling the pool walls with a jackhammer that rattled Thomas's teeth even from inside the house. He was on a conference call when the pounding suddenly stopped. Through his home office window, Thomas could see the crew foreman engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with someone on the other side of the fence. The worker's body language, hands raised, head shaking, suggested it wasn't going well. When the doorbell rang 3 minutes later, Thomas excused himself from the call and opened the front door to find Eleanor Pembroke standing on his porch, her thin frame vibrating with indignation beneath a powder blue cardigan. "You can't just remove a swimming pool," she declared before Thomas could even say hello. Her white hair was perfectly coiffed, contrasting sharply with her flushed face. "It's against the Homeowners Association bylaws." Thomas blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Pembroke, I checked with the city. I have all the permits. The bylaws clearly state that all exterior modifications must be approved by the architectural committee," she interrupted, stabbing a bony finger toward his chest. "This is destroying neighborhood property values." "It's my property," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice level. "And there hasn't been an active HOA here in at least 5 years. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the authorities." Thomas watched in disbelief as she marched back across his lawn, phone already pressed to her ear. She can't be serious to kill the foreman who had appeared at his side. The man shrugged. "Happens more than you think. Want us to keep going?" Thomas nodded, returning to his conference call as the jackhammer resumed its thunderous rhythm. He figured Eleanor was bluffing, probably calling the city to check on his permits. He certainly didn't expect what happened 45 minutes later when 2 police cruisers, lights flashing, pulled up in front of his house. Thomas hastily ended his conference call and stepped outside, heart pounding. 2 police officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man and a younger woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, were making their way up his driveway. Behind them, Eleanor Pembroke stood at the edge of her property, arms crossed triumphantly over her cardigan. "Afternoon, officers," Thomas called out, trying to sound casual despite the construction chaos surrounding him. The demolition crew had paused their work again, jackhammer silence mid-destruction, the excavator's engine idling. "Good afternoon, sir," the male officer replied. His name tag read Officer Daniels. "We received a call about a potential code violation and property damage in progress." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "Let me guess Mrs. Pembroke called you." The female officer glanced down at her notepad. "According to dispatch, we received a 911 call reporting, and I quote, destruction of neighborhood property values and illegal pool removal without HOA approval." She looked up, her expression professionally neutral, but Thomas noticed the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. "I can explain everything," Thomas said, reaching inside the door for the folder of permits he'd been required to obtain. "I have all the necessary paperwork. City approved everything last week." Officer Daniels accepted the folder and began flipping through the documents while his partner surveyed the half-demolished pool. Eleanor had now ventured closer, hovering near the police cruisers. "Ma'am," the female officer called out, "could you please join us? I understand you placed the call." Eleanor approached with remarkable speed for someone her age. "I most certainly did, officer. This man is violating our Homeowners Association bylaws. Section 7, Paragraph 3 clearly states that no exterior modifications may be made without committee approval. Thomas sighed. As I tried to explain to Mrs. Pembroke earlier, our HOA dissolved 5 years ago. The last president moved to Florida and no one took over. That doesn't mean the bylaws aren't still in effect, Eleanor insisted. Officer Daniels handed the permits back to Thomas. Everything appears to be in order with the city, sir. He turned to Eleanor. Ma'am, did you call 911 for this matter? Eleanor lifted her chin. I did. This is an emergency. Do you know what a pool removal does to property values? My retirement depends on the value of my home. The female officer's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Ma'am, 911 is for life-threatening emergencies. This is an emergency. Eleanor interrupted. He's destroying $30,000 of my home equity right before my eyes. At that moment, the foreman approached, hard hat in hand. Excuse me, officers. I've been doing pool removals for 15 years. Actually, removing an old, unmaintained pool like this one typically increases property values, especially when it's replaced with usable yard space. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed without sound, resembling one of the koi fish Thomas had rehomed the previous week. Is that true? The female officer asked, her curiosity apparently genuine. The foreman nodded. Insurance companies hate pools. They're liability nightmares. Most home buyers with young kids see them as dangerous. And older buyers, they don't want the maintenance. Officer Daniels cleared his throat, clearly fighting to maintain his professional composure. Ma'am, it appears Mr. Mackenzie has all the proper permits, and there's no active HOA to enforce the bylaws you're referencing. But, Eleanor sputtered. Thomas felt a pang of sympathy despite his frustration. Mrs. Pembroke, I'm planning to put in a garden and a small patio. It'll look much nicer than a cracked, unused pool. The female officer's radio crackled with a call about a fender bender on Main Street. She exchanged glances with her partner. Mrs. Pembroke, Officer Daniels said gently, in the future, please call the non-emergency line for neighborhood concerns. As for today, there's no violation taking place here. Eleanor's face flushed deeper. So you're just going to let him destroy the neighborhood? The female officer's composure finally broke. A small snort escaped her, which she quickly disguised as a cough. Ma'am, we need to respond to an actual emergency now. Mr. Mackenzie is within his rights. As the officers turned to leave, Thomas overheard Officer Daniels murmur to his partner, third HOA call this week, remember the guy who painted his door the wrong shade of beige. The female officer's shoulders shook slightly as she responded too quietly for Thomas to hear, but their suppressed laughter was evident as they returned to their cruisers. Eleanor remained rooted in place, watching the police drive away. When she finally turned to Thomas, her expression had transformed from righteous indignation to something more calculating. This isn't over, Mr. Mackenzie, she said quietly. Not by a long shot. Thomas watched her retreat to her home, a sense of unease replacing his relief. The demolition crew resumed their work, the jackhammer's rhythm somehow less satisfying than before. That evening, as Thomas microwaved a frozen dinner, he noticed Eleanor speaking with several other neighbors in the cul-de-sac, gesturing animatedly toward his house. One by one, heads turned to stare his property. The following morning, Thomas awoke to the sound of his doorbell ringing insistently. Bleary-eyed and still in his pajamas, he stumbled downstairs and peered through the peephole to find a man in a crisp polo shirt holding a clipboard. The stranger's vehicle, a white SUV with City of Oak Ridge Code Enforcement emblazoned on the door, was parked at the curb. Thomas groaned and opened the door. Good morning, the man said briskly. I'm Carl Winters, Code Enforcement. We've received multiple complaints about construction activity at this address. Multiple complaints? Thomas echoed, running a hand through his bed-rumpled hair. Let me guess, Eleanor Pembroke and... I'm not at liberty to disclose complainants, Carl replied, though his slight grimace told Thomas everything he needed to know. I'll need to inspect your demolition site and verify permits. Thomas led the inspector through the house to the backyard, where the demolition crew was just arriving. The pool was now a jagged crater of broken concrete and exposed rebar. The foreman greeted them with a knowing look. Another complaint, he asked, exchanging a glance with Thomas. Apparently several, Thomas replied. The code enforcement officer meticulously examined Thomas' permits, measured setbacks from the property line, and took numerous photos. Finding everything in order, he finally closed his clipboard. Your permits are valid, he admitted reluctantly. However, there have been noise complaints regarding your construction activities. We haven't started before 8 a.m., the foreman interjected. City ordinance allows construction from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays. Carl nodded. That's correct. However, I'm issuing a courtesy warning about dust control. Your crew needs to wipe down the demolition area regularly to prevent excessive dust. After the inspector left, Thomas noticed Eleanor watching from her kitchen window. When their eyes met, she quickly disappeared behind her curtain. "What's her problem anyway?" Thomas asked the foreman. The man chuckled. "Some people just can't stand others making changes. Had a job last year where the neighbor tried to sabotage our equipment because we were removing a dead oak tree." By noon, the situation had escalated further. Thomas was on another work call when his doorbell rang yet again. This time, he found a young woman in business casual attire on his porch. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm Rebecca Torres from the Oak Ridge Tribune," she said, holding up a press badge. "We received a tip about a neighborhood dispute involving your pool removal. Several residents claim this project is decreasing property values and disrupting the character of the neighborhood. Care to comment?" Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "The local newspaper is covering a pool removal." Rebecca shrugged apologetically. "Slow news week. Plus, the tip mentioned police involvement." "It's a non-story," Thomas insisted. "I have all the necessary permits. My elderly neighbor called 911 because she thinks an inactive HOA should have authority over my property." Rebecca's eyes lit up. "She called 911 over a pool removal? That's actually more interesting than the angle I was given." Thomas immediately regretted his candor. "Look, I'd appreciate it if you didn't." "Mr. Mackenzie?" A new voice interrupted them. Thomas turned to find a heavy-set man with 3 other neighbors in tow approaching his driveway. He recognized them from neighborhood barbecues years ago, but couldn't recall their names. "I'm Dan Caldwell from 2 streets over," the man announced. "We formed a neighborhood preservation committee in response to your project." He said the last word as if describing something obscene. "A preservation committee?" Thomas repeated, feeling like he had stumbled into some bizarre alternate reality. "We've drafted a petition," Dan continued, brandishing a document with several signatures. "We believe your pool removal sets a dangerous precedent for arbitrary property modifications." The reporter was scribbling furiously in her notepad, clearly delighted by this unexpected development. Dangerous precedent? Thomas couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. "It's a cracked, leaking pool that would cost $12,000 to repair." One of the other neighbors, a woman in her 60s, stepped forward. "Our community has a certain aesthetic standard. Swimming pools are part of our neighborhood's appeal." "Have any of you actually seen my pool?" Thomas asked. "Because it's been a swampy mosquito breeding ground for years." The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of a truck backing into Thomas's driveway. A flat loaded with several tons of clean-filled dirt had arrived, ready to fill the hole once demolition was complete. "Excuse me," Thomas said, moving to direct the truck driver. As he walked away, he heard Dan telling the reporter, "This is exactly the kind of unilateral decision-making that destroys community cohesion." By late afternoon, the demolition was complete. The pool was now just a memory, a gaping hole in the earth waiting to be filled. Thomas stood at the edge, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that had little to do with the physical removal and everything to do with the unexpected social fallout. As the crew began filling the hole with dirt, Thomas noticed a police cruiser slowly passing by his house. It was the same female officer from yesterday, clearly on a routine patrol. When she spotted Thomas, she raised her coffee cup in a subtle salute, her lips twitching into a barely suppressed smile. At least someone found the situation amusing. Thomas waved back, unaware that Eleanor Pembroke was documenting the exchange with her zoom lens from her upstairs window, adding to her growing collection of evidence. By Friday evening, Thomas' property had transformed remarkably. The gaping hole where his pool once existed was now filled with fresh soil, tamped down and graded for proper drainage. The demolition crew had finished earlier than expected, removed their equipment, and left Thomas standing in his backyard with a sense of accomplishment and a strange emptiness that had nothing to do with the missing pool. His satisfaction was short-lived. At precisely 7:03 p.m., his doorbell rang again. "If that's Eleanor," he muttered, striding to the door. Instead, he found a teenage boy holding a stack of papers. "Neighborhood meeting announcement," the kid said blandly, handing Thomas a flyer before turning to leave. Thomas examined the paper, his eyebrows climbing higher with every line. "Emergency neighborhood meeting. Sunday 4 p.m. OAKRIDG Community Center. AGENDA. Preserving community standards and property values. Specialty establishing neighborhood covenants and restrictions." At the bottom, in smaller print, refreshments provided by Eleanor Pembroke. Thomas crumpled the flyer in his fist. The audacity was almost impressive. He was about to toss it in the recycling when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Thomas. This is Officer Ramirez from OPD. Just FYI, your neighbor has called non-emergency 3 times since yesterday about suspicious activity at your property. Thought you should know. Sorry about this." Thomas stared at the message, torn between gratitude for the heads-up and dismay at Eleanor's persistence. He texted back a quick thanks, adding, "Any chance you'll be patrolling Sunday afternoon near the community center?" The response came quickly. "Probably. Why?" "Might need crowd control at the emergency neighborhood meeting about my pool." A moment later, 3 laughing emojis appeared. Thomas spent Saturday spreading topsoil and planning his garden layout, doing his best to ignore Eleanor's surveillance from her upstairs window. Occasionally, neighbors drove by slowly, craning their necks to see the transformation in his backyard. Some waved, others frowned disapprovingly. By Sunday afternoon, Thomas had decided to attend the meeting. He considered skipping it, but curiosity and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated won out. He arrived at the community center 10 minutes early to find the parking lot surprisingly full. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in rows facing a small podium. A table of cookies, punch, and coffee stood at the back, Eleanor's promised refreshments. Thomas counted at least 30 people, milling about far more than he'd expected. He slipped into his seat in the back row, nodding at a few familiar faces. Dan Caldwell and the Preservation Committee occupied the front row, conferring in low voices. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. At exactly 4 p.m., the side door opened and Eleanor made her entrance. She traded her usual cardigan for a blazer that gave her the air of someone chairing a corporate board meeting. She marched to the podium with purpose, tapping the microphone twice. "Thank you all for coming to this important community discussion," she began, her voice carrying surprising authority. "As many of you know, our neighborhood has recently faced a situation that highlights the vulnerability of our property values and aesthetic standards." Thomas fought the urge to roll his eyes. For those unaware, Eleanor continued, "A certain resident, her eyes found Thomas in the back row, has unilaterally decided to remove a swimming pool, a valuable neighborhood amenity, without consulting adjacent homeowners." A murmur rippled through the audience. Thomas noticed several people turning to look at him. While technically legal, Eleanor conceded with obvious reluctance, this action represents the kind of unchecked individualism that can erode community cohesion and property values. "Today, I propose we establish a new homeowners association with binding covenants to prevent such actions in the future." Dan Caldwell stood up. "I've drafted preliminary bylaws," he announced, holding up a thick document. "We'll need 2/3 of homeowners to sign on." A middle-aged woman near the front raised her hand. "What exactly would these covenants restrict?" Eleanor smiled. "Excellent question, Janice. We're proposing oversight of exterior paint colors, landscaping changes, structural modifications. So I need permission to plant a rosebush," someone called out. "Only for front yards visible from the street," Dan explained. "And how much would these HOA dues be?" asked another homeowner. Eleanor cleared her throat. "We're proposing a modest $75 monthly fee to cover administration and community improvements." The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Thomas watched with growing amusement as the mood shifted palpably. $75 a month because someone filled in their pool? A man in a Packers jersey exclaimed loudly. Eleanor tapped the microphone again. "It's not just about the pool. It's about protecting our investments." A woman Thomas recognized as a real estate agent stood up. "Actually, I should mention that pools can be liability issues for resale. Many buyers see them as maintenance headaches rather than assets." "Exactly." Thomas couldn't stop himself from calling out. "Mine was cracked and would have cost $12,000 to repair." All eyes turned to him. Eleanor glared from the podium. "Perhaps Mr. Mackenzie would like to explain himself to the community," she said coldly. Thomas hadn't planned to speak, but found himself walking to the front. Eleanor reluctantly stepped aside, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Look," Thomas said, facing his neighbors, "I understand change can be concerning, but my pool was a safety hazard and a financial drain. I'm replacing it with a garden that will actually enhance the property." He paused, then added, "And I promise not to call 911 if any of you decide to paint your front door without my permission." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Even Dan Caldwell cracked a smile. At that moment, the back door opened and Officer Ramirez stepped in, surveying the scene with professional interest before casually leaning against the wall. When she caught Thomas' eye, she gave an almost imperceptible nod. As the meeting devolved into heated debates about HOA fees and property rights, Thomas quietly made his exit, nodding to Officer Ramirez on his way out. In the parking lot, he took a deep breath of the spring air, feeling unexpectedly lighter. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife. "Kids want to know if the pool is ready for summer swimming." Thomas chuckled as he replied, "Actually, I have a surprise for them next visit." How do they feel about gardening? Monday morning greeted Thomas with surprisingly pleasant weather. He stood in his backyard with a cup of coffee, surveying the newly leveled ground and mentally planning his garden layout. The weekend's neighborhood drama felt distant in the calm morning light, and he allowed himself to hope that perhaps the worst was behind him. That illusion shattered when his phone began buzzing incessantly with text messages just after 9 a.m. Have you seen the Tribune? Mom, dude, you're famous. Check page 3, Mark from work. The kids are going to die laughing when they see this. Call me, Diane. With a growing sense of unease, Thomas opened his laptop and navigated to the Oak Ridge Tribune's website. He didn't have to search long. Featured prominently on the local news section was the headline, Pool Patrol. How one man's home improvement sparked a neighborhood civil war. You've got to be kidding me, Thomas muttered, clicking on the article. Rebecca Torres, the reporter who had visited his property, had indeed crafted quite a story. Complete with photos of his half-demolished pool, Eleanor's stern face at the community meeting podium, and even a shot of the police cruiser parked outside his house, the article painted a picture of suburban chaos that bore only a passing resemblance to reality. When Thomas Mackenzie decided to remove his backyard swimming pool last week, he never expected to spark a community uprising that would involve police intervention, an emergency neighborhood meeting, and deep questions about property rights in Oak Ridge estates, the article began. Thomas scrolled through in horror as the piece detailed Eleanor's 911 call, an unprecedented use of emergency services for an HOA dispute, according to a quoted police spokesperson, the hastily organized community meeting, and the simmering tensions in the formerly peaceful neighborhood. The article concluded with a particularly mortifying paragraph. When reached for comment, Officer Maria Ramirez of the Oak Ridge Police Department could barely contain her amusement. In my 8 years on the force, this is certainly the most unique non-emergency we've been called to repeatedly, she said. While we understand Ms. Pembroke's concerns about property values, we would encourage residents to reserve 911 for actual emergencies, not landscaping disputes. Thomas's phone rang. It was his boss. I see you've been busy, she said when he answered, amusement evident in her voice. The article mentions you work from home for Soft Solutions. Peter wants to know if you'll be mentioning the company in any future news stories about your infamous pool. Very funny, Thomas groaned. This will blow over in a day or two. I wouldn't be so sure, his boss replied. The comment section on that article is blowing up. You become a symbol in the property rights versus community standards debate. Anyway, just keep us out of it, okay? After hanging up, Thomas made the mistake of checking the article's comments. His boss wasn't exaggerating. Nearly 100 people had weighed in, most of them firmly on Team Thomas or Team Eleanor, with passionate arguments about individual rights versus community aesthetics. His doorbell rang. Thomas opened the door to find a delivery person holding a large gift basket wrapped in cellophane. Delivery for Thomas Mackenzie, the courier said, handing him the basket. Thomas examined the basket, filled with gardening supplies, seeds, gloves, and small tools. A card was attached. From your friends at Oak Ridge Garden Center. Call us when you're ready to transform that empty pool space. P.S. We loved the article. He was still processing this unexpected development when another car pulled up. The window rolled down to reveal Officer Daniels from the initial police visit. Morning, Mr. Mackenzie, he called out. Just doing a routine patrol. Everything quiet today? Thomas held up the newspaper. Apparently, I'm leading a civil war. Officer Daniels chuckled. Yeah, we've all read it. Chief had it posted in the break room. Just wanted to let you know we've had a word with Ms. Pembroke about appropriate use of emergency services. I appreciate that, Thomas replied. As Officer Daniels drove away, Thomas noticed Eleanor's curtains twitching again. This time, however, she didn't immediately disappear when caught watching. Instead, she stared directly at him for several seconds before deliberately closing her blinds. Throughout the day, Thomas received more texts and calls from friends, family, and even long-lost acquaintances who had seen the article. By evening, he was thoroughly exhausted by the attention and decided to turn off his phone and enjoy some peace and quiet. He was just settling in with a book when a knock came at his back door. Puzzled, nobody ever used his back entrance, he cautiously approached and peered through the curtain. His neighbor from the north side, Jim Miller, stood on the small patio, holding what appeared to be architectural drawings. Hey, Jim, Thomas said, opening the door. Everything okay? Sorry to bother you, Jim said, looking somewhat embarrassed. Saw the article. Helen and I just wanted to say we're on your side in all this. Eleanor tried to report us last summer for putting in a vegetable garden instead of ornamental plants. Thomas smiled, feeling a wave of relief at having at least some allies in the neighborhood. Thanks. That means a lot. Actually, Jim continued, unrolling the papers he was carrying, I had another reason for stopping by. I'm a landscape architect, as you might remember. After seeing what happened with your pool, I got to thinking about our own. We never use it either, and the maintenance is a pain. He spread the drawings on Thomas's counter. They showed detailed plans for converting a swimming pool into a sunken patio garden with built-in seating and raised beds. I was wondering if you'd consider letting me design something like this for your space. No charge, I just like to use it as a showcase project. Might help change the narrative around what you're doing. Thomas studied the beautiful designs, a smile spreading across his face. These are amazing, Jim. Are you sure? Jim nodded. Positive. And between us, at least 3 other neighbors with pools have called my office today asking about removal auctions. You might have started a trend. As they discussed design possibilities, Thomas couldn't help but glance toward Eleanor's house, where a single upstairs light remained on. He wondered how she would react when she discovered that her campaign against him was having exactly the opposite effect from what she'd intended. 3 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Thomas' backyard had become the center of an unexpected community project, with Jim Miller overseeing the transformation of the former pool area into what he called a conversation garden, a sunken patio surrounded by tiered planking beds, with built-in seating and a small fountain where the deep end had once been. What had begun as Jim's solo project had somehow evolved into a neighborhood affair. The Johnsons from across the street had donated perennials from their overflowing garden. Mark and David from 2 doors down had helped install the irrigation system. Even Janice, who had asked pointed questions at Eleanor's meeting, had shown up with homemade lemonade and her teenage sons to help move soil and pavers. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching as Jim directed the placement of stone steps leading down to the patio. The transformation wasn't just happening to his yard, he felt changed as well. After 3 years of post-divorce isolation, he suddenly knew more neighbors than he had in the previous decade of living in the house. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Kids packed gardening clothes for this weekend. Sophie wants to plant sunflowers. That up? Thomas smiled as he replied, perfect. The beds along the fence get full sun. The newspaper article, rather than being a source of embarrassment, had turned Thomas into something of a local celebrity. 2 more articles had followed, one about the changing face of suburban recreation and another profiling Jim Miller and his revolutionary approach to repurposing outdated backyard pools. The garden center that had sent the gift basket was now a project sponsor, providing plants at cost in exchange for being featured in the articles. Only Eleanor Pembroke remained unmoved by the positive developments. She had escalated to formal complaints with the city about noise, dust, and excessive visitor traffic to Thomas' property. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but she persisted with a determination that would have been admirable in any other context. Thomas had made several attempts at reconciliation, inviting her to see the garden plans, offering to plant privacy shrubs along their shared property line, even leaving a peace offering of tomato seedlings on her porch. All had been rebuffed or ignored. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, as the garden neared completion, Thomas noticed a white SUV pulling up in front of his house. He recognized it immediately. Carl Winters from Code Enforcement, back for another inspection. With a sigh, Thomas went outside to meet him. Afternoon, Carl. Let me guess. Another complaint? The Code Enforcement officer gave him a weary smile. You know the drill by now, Mr. Mackenzie. I'm required to follow up on all formal complaints. Thomas led him through to the backyard, where work was proceeding smoothly. Jim waved from where he was discussing drainage with another neighbor. Carl surveyed the transformation with obvious appreciation. I have to say, this is quite impressive. Thanks, Thomas replied. So what's the complaint this time? Dust again. Carl checked his clipboard. Let's see. Unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone. Ms. Pembroke claims you're operating a garden center business from your home due to the delivery vehicles and visitor traffic. Jim, overhearing this, approached with an incredulous expression. You've got to be kidding me. This is a private landscape project with volunteer help. Carl nodded. I can see that. And there's no violation here. He lowered his voice, glancing toward Eleanor's house. Between us, we're considering implementing a policy about repeated, unfounded complaints. There are actual violations in the city that need attention. As Carl was leaving, a police cruiser pulled up. Officers Ramirez and Daniels emerged, and Thomas felt a momentary panic until he noticed they were in casual clothes, not uniforms. We're off duty, Officer Ramirez explained when she saw his expression. Jim invited us to see the project. You two know each other? Thomas asked, surprised. Jim grinned. Maria is my cousin. She's been keeping me updated on the pool patrol saga. Officer Daniels surveyed the garden with appreciation. So this is what caused all the fuss? Is beautiful. Almost finished too, Jim replied proudly. We're having a little ribbon cutting on Saturday. Thomas is hosting a garden party to thank everyone who helped. Thomas had been so occupied watching this exchange that he didn't immediately notice the commotion at the fence line. A sharp voice cut through the pleasant afternoon atmosphere. I want to speak to those officers immediately. Eleanor Pembroke stood at the garden gate, clutching a folder of papers, her face flushed with indignation. Mrs. Pembroke, Thomas began, attempting civility. We're just. This is outrageous. Eleanor interrupted, marching into the yard. First, you destroy neighborhood property values, then you turn your home into a commercial venue, and now, she jabbed a finger toward officers Ramirez and Daniels. You're consorting with police officers to intimidate me. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, her expression professionally neutral despite being off duty. Ma'am, we're here as private citizens to view a friend's landscaping project. A likely story. Eleanor brandished her folder. I've documented everything. The constant deliveries, the stream of visitors, the noise violations. This was a quiet, respectable neighborhood before she glared at Thomas, decided to destroy its character. Jim cleared his throat. Mrs. Pembroke, I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Jim Miller, your neighbor from 2 doors down and a licensed landscape architect. This is a private residential project that I designed. There's no commercial activity happening here. Eleanor seemed momentarily taken aback by this information but quickly rallied. Then explained why there have been delivery trucks here almost daily. Materials for the garden, Jim explained patiently. Just like when you had your roof replaced last year. And all these people? She gestured around at the small group of neighbors working in various parts of the garden. Neighbors helping neighbors, Jim replied. A community coming together. You're welcome to join us, by the way. We could use help planting the lavender border. Eleanor stared at him, then at the transformed space that had once been a dilapidated pool. For a brief moment, Thomas thought he saw something flicker across her face, perhaps surprise or even a hint of admiration, before her expression hardened again. This isn't over, she declared, though with noticeably less conviction than before. The property values are likely to increase with this beautiful landscape feature, Jim finished for her. I've been designing gardens for 20 years, Mrs. Pembroke. Trust me on this. Eleanor stood in silence for a long moment, her certainty visibly wavering as she took in the nearly completed garden with its stone paths, tiered beds, and burbling fountain. Saturday at 4 p.m. Thomas said quietly, The garden party? You're invited too. Without another word, Eleanor turned and marched back to her house, her folder of complaints clutched tightly against her chest. As she disappeared through her back door, Officer Daniels turned to Thomas with a bemused expression. You really invited her to your party. Thomas shrugged, seemed like the right thing to do. Brave man, Jim commented, slapping him on the shoulder. Now let's finish those steps before sundown. As work resumed on the garden, Thomas couldn't help glancing occasionally at Eleanor's house, wondering what his obstinate neighbor would do next. The battle might not be over, but for the first time he felt like a peaceful resolution might actually be possible.